great to see you again. So another week has gone by in franchising. What's everybody been up to?
No, tell us what you've been up to. You've been to the other side of the ocean. So IFA, I'm dying to hear
Exciting.
like what's coming out.
Yeah, it was I love IFA. This is the third one that I've been to. Last year I went to Vegas and Phoenix this year. It was awesome. It was really good. There were about 3,500, I guess, in
Wow.
total. And as I put in one of my posts, we know with IFA the majority of people are from North America, but there were 30 countries represented, so a really good cross section of the franchising space from across the world, which is great. I think that the key things that I took away from it. One was the wider economy. It was really interesting to listen to one of the America's big economists who talked about all of the fundamentals being in place for really good, solid growth in the North American economy, despite the American economy in particular, despite the political turmoil that they're going through. And there were so many similarities between what's happening there and what we see here. The only difference between the two is that they're already on a growth path of, I think it was around about 2%. And of course, we're sitting flatlining in the UK with a bit of a recession. But apart from that, all the fundamentals, inflation, unemployment, investment levels, everything that he was talking about, he was saying that this is pointing to substantial growth going forward for the next probably decade. So that was exciting to see. And the other thing which really struck me, and this is because I sat on a round table and had a discussion with a particular gentleman, was the continual development of multi-brand and multi-unit franchisees, and they are being seen so much more as proper, true businessmen in their own right. This one guy that was heading up a roundtable for discussion, Jesse Kaiser, he runs a business with his brother called Kaiser Enterprises. And between him and his brother in that business, they have 50 franchise units across two brands. One in the home care sector, not in the home care sector, home services sector. I think it was carpet cleaning, and the other brand was hairdressing.
Wow.
And it's a really substantial business. The interesting thing was that he didn't at all appear too big for his own boots as a franchisee. He was very, very respectful of the franchisors. And he told a story of when he was a very, very successful Little Caesars pizza franchisee, and he wanted to invest in another pizza, Little Caesars, and the franchisor wouldn't let him because his fundamental numbers weren't right, his gross profit margins and this type of thing. And so I'm talking a long time about IFA. I do apologise, but there are a couple of points which I really, really enjoyed. Of course, all the jamboree stuff at the side, having dinners and Fran Jam, etc., which is always good. And as you've probably seen on my socials and a lot of other people's socials, driverless cabs wandering
That's
around.
that's what I was interested in. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I want to come back to some of the other things because it relates to franchising. But just a little aside, I think I posted on your post. So I had a little bet. It's been a bit of a week in the Ayres house, and my daughter's failed a driving test for the second time, which, seeing as I taught her, feels a little bit like I failed my driving test all over again. But I remember. Sorry.
I'd say it's definitely your fault that she failed.
Yeah, it's totally my fault, clearly, yeah. But I remember her, when she was about 6 or 7, I think it was, she said her cousin was learning to drive. And she said, Dad, when can I learn to drive? And I said, well, when you're 17. But I reckon by then the car will drive itself. So
Wow.
argue you can't buy a car that will drive itself, but you can travel to Phoenix and go in one that will drive itself. So it's kind of I feel I've sort of won that bet, or half won that bet. Which given it was quite a long time I said it. I'm quite pleased about that. Anyway, that's an aside, but.
Yeah, we won't spend too much time on the subject of driverless vehicles because I was so amazed by it, and others were as well. But it's quite an experience.
But coming back to what you were saying about multi-unit, multi-brands, I think I've definitely seen it's on the rise in the UK. It's definitely something that's becoming more popular, and I certainly speak to clients who are very much sort of have that mindset of they're not just interested in having one. Their plan is to have several franchised operations, whether within the same brand or across multiple brands. And I do think it's a little bit, there are always, so many considerations, and we've spoken, this is something that's been discussed, many times in other forums, and on the BFA Power Hour, we've talked about that and sort of conditions that franchisors should consider, having as criteria before, obviously, they give consent to their franchisees taking on another. But I always think it's a little bit short-sighted of franchisors who just adopt the blank no approach and not willing to sort of consider and look, because I think sometimes the risk is you might lose a really, really good operator who would actually be really great. And but I suppose it will always come down to, it depends on the brand, it depends on the type of business, it depends on what the franchisee is proposing and how it's going to be managed, and whether that person is fitting in with the culture and the brand, where he's a franchisee or she is a franchisee.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you more and more, and this is what I'm saying. We always know when something happens in the US over time, it tends to happen here as well. So it feels to me that the time is absolutely right now that all franchisors need to start considering what multi-unit looks like, what that model looks like, and they drive that conversation with the franchisees, and also be open to multi-brand, and don't be frightened of it when a franchisee comes along and says, I've got this home cleaning business, I now want to buy a gutter cleaning business, because the two of them sort of fit together. So I think it's really important that opens up franchising as a real vehicle to individual, satisfying individual aspirations, rather than very often we see franchisees being franchisees only once in their lifetime. They may go for a renewal on one unit, and then they sell. But we really don't want that. We want growing businesses. And this
it struck me ever since I've kind of, I remember on the BFA Power Hour quite early on, actually, that I was surprised there wasn't that conversation, not just going up the franchisee level, getting bigger and bigger, but the franchisor level, making partnerships. You see that with companies like Neighbourly, where they become a conglomerate of brands, but not even necessarily buying up brands and becoming one company at this level, but more just having partnerships where there might be some natural synergy between a particular brand and another brand, where they're not necessarily even competing, but their values or something about their model, or the way they operate different times of day maybe allow people to, there's some synergy, but not identicalness. Otherwise, you're in competition. That if once they get to a certain level of maturity, if the franchisor is having that sort of level of discussion, they're even facilitating people becoming multi-brand franchisees, and that's perceived as a good thing, as another route to maturity, fresh challenge, revitalizing the brand and so on.
Yeah.
And I think it happens. It does happen. It just doesn't happen as much as perhaps in in the US, for example. But then again, I think let's not forget that US is ahead of us in terms of franchising, and so we are sort of whatever is happening in the US today is probably going to be happening here in 10 years' time.
Yeah. No,
Do
exactly.
you think that's partly a factor of just the size of the market? Because obviously the size of the opportunity is so much bigger. You can be so much bigger in every, no matter what it is, what brand you are. So you can reach a level of maturity that even if a franchise, with some franchises, even if they were saturated, they just can't be as big as they'd be in the States.
Yeah, I think that's the always got to be careful. And I know I always get excited if I'm looking at the States and going, oh, look what they're doing. Why can't we do that back in the UK? But of course, the reality is that it is their population, their economy, everything is 6 or 7 times bigger than the UK. The number of franchise brands is at least 5 times bigger than the UK. So, and so if you've got a multi-unit, multi-brand franchisee who's got 50 units in the States, that extrapolates out to somebody having 10 units over here, really, between 8 and 10 units. So there is a difference between the two, but I think that the conversation is going to become spread far and wide over the next few years. So there was just as we were leaving Phoenix, the next big conference on the agenda for franchising was the multi-unit, multi-brand conference in Las Vegas, which I know Richard Davis was heading out to, and a whole lot of others at IFA. It's big enough now in the States that they hold a conference for it. Both franchisees and franchisors attend. So yeah, really interesting, really interesting. Yeah.
And I think to just add to that, I think also the more it's like what we are seeing with the forums like the BFA, and the more franchisors join that, and the more we have the interaction and events like the conference, etc., the more we will, I think, start to see those type of collaborations and those relationships developing. Because like you say, that is absolutely key. And of course there is that global influence as well. So anything, any brands that are coming from the US, they will be bringing that with them and inevitably influencing the way things are developing in the UK. But again, what's really interesting is, I don't know, I have really noticed the difference in sort of appetite of franchisees from 10 years ago to today, just in terms of the type of people who are getting involved. And I think it would be probably fair to say that the average age of a franchisee is coming down, and we get more younger people joining and investing. And I think inevitably that will drive the the multi-unit and multi-brand ownership, because if the operators join earlier on in their life and their career, they inevitably see that as an opportunity and growth. And they're not very much, they're not looking to buy a business, develop it to a certain standard and retire. They're looking at this as, this is my future and I want to develop it more and I want to see what's possible. And I think that's the sort of the mindset that we're seeing more and more today.
That's great insight there about that age. That, of course, it's anecdotal, but it would be really interesting to know whether that is, no matter how slow that trend is, because, that I think we've all in franchising sort of seen the typical franchisee, with all due respect to them, being the, very late 40s into their 50s, sometimes into their 60s. Having been made redundant, et cetera, et cetera. And there isn't that time to build up that portfolio of units and brands. And quite often these people are saying, look, I need to just earn enough until I retire. If they're starting younger, that's a great sign.
And my kids, do you think that'd be driven by the bank of mum and dad? You know, if you want to see your kids, instead of necessarily investing in university education or just like, how do I help my kids launch? If you've been a successful franchisee, like, how do I get my kids? You've got my mind thinking now with my kids. You know, my younger daughter, you know, getting set up with one of the kids' drama or dance franchises when she's a bit older. You know.
I think you're absolutely right. I know of at least one person within the franchising sector who has stated for at least the last 3 years he is going to give his children a franchise as their 21st birthday present.
Wow, nice present.
Nice present. Yeah. And then I was talking to somebody just recently, 20-year-old, who is part of a franchisor brand, but she wants to invest in that brand, but because she's so young, she can't get the funding, and she hasn't got the access from the bank of mum and dad, and therein lies the challenge. And I know I do know of another brand at the moment who is launching a program to attract young people, where they are funding the franchise fee through an increased royalty over a period of time. I don't think it's unique. But
I think that's a great idea, because that's kind of looking at, you know, it's looking at your options and kind of going, okay, well, what can we do to give opportunities to those who can't come up with a higher, you know, upfront fee? And actually, instead of saying we are discounting the fee or doing something like that, actually, let's look at how we can spread that cost. And, you know, and that's a great idea. I've you know, I've seen, I'm aware of somebody doing that too. And I thought, yeah, that's fab. But just to come back just on something that Kevin mentioned, and what you said about, you know, the franchisee sort of planning to give his children franchise as a birthday present. And, you know, and I think that's absolute, you know, that's great. And again, I'm seeing more and more, and I think probably because of the sort of the time we've had now in franchising and the awareness that is being built, we see sort of almost franchise families. So, you know, when kids grow up with that understanding of franchising, then that seems to be a very natural fit and very natural future for them. Obviously, the only thing to say that, you know, of course, as a franchise owner, you know, the individual behind the franchise would always be, you know, subject to approval of the franchisor. And just because, you know, mum or dad as a franchisee is suitable and is doing great doesn't necessarily say the kids will be approved, or would want to be involved in that. But, you know, I think probably more likely than not is those who grow up with it see the opportunities and see the advantages, and then probably sort of get that bug and decide, yeah, actually this is for me and this is going to be my future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Again, I know of a really successful situation like that within Tutor Doctor. When I worked with Tutor Doctor, a very successful mum and dad franchise stepped, and they employed both of their daughters as they got old enough into the business, and they became an integral part of it. They loved the business. The original franchisee stepped back, mum and dad stepped back, approached the franchisor and said, can our two daughters carry on? They're now the franchisees, and they are doing an exceptional job. But that in that instance, it just worked. And as you say, for some, it won't work. But yeah, it's more and more we're going to see these opportunities come to the fore. Exciting.
They bring it. Right? Just thinking about, I mean, it's a slightly personal example, but I'm just sort of thinking, sort of trying to extrapolate from that, thinking about my youngest daughter again taking on some like a stage school type. I'm trying not to mention any brand names here, but there's lots of them out there, are dance ones and so on. She would bring a already quite good network and she'd be really good at the social media side, right? Which for those kind of, I mean, that's true for any brand up to a point, but for those type of brands in, reaching their audience would be extremely important. It's obviously highly visual, grown up TikToking, and dancing to TikToks and all those sort of things. So yeah, they bring you a whole new set of skills that those older franchisees don't necessarily they have to learn, are actually quite nervous about.
No, exactly. You're so right, Kevin. Well, you and I, Kevin, know all about dancing on TikTok.
Yes.
I don't know how I missed that.
No. Have you missed it? Have you not been?
No, I have seen it.
Oh, right.
That's because you run in the other direction. That's where I'm a big show off, and Tim's a sucker for being dragged in. So I think so.
But talking about that, I mean, and I always found it really interesting, when we talk about marketing, franchise marketing and recruitment of franchisees, and when we sort of, obviously we talk about creating avatars and creating your perfect franchisee profile, of which there may be more than one, of course.
Yeah.
And then it's the fact that you then need to, you need then to look at, well, if those are my ideal, franchisees, where do they go? What do they use? Where do they spend their time? And then market to them accordingly. And I think, the fact that, if it's not necessarily, we're not, that we're not marketing by showing what we have right now in terms of our people or what our franchisees, but it's focusing on what we want to have. So it's sort of going back to a few years ago, and I remember one of the franchisors was saying, we had mostly men, and we really wanted to recruit more women, but that meant that actually in our franchise marketing we needed to portray more women, because otherwise all that we kept perpetuating is attracting more and more men, because our marketing was male led, and it's just sort of being open to think, to sort of appreciating that we're not necessarily we're not necessarily on the same channels as those that we're trying to to attract, and it's sort of being brave enough to go to those channels that we might not be familiar with.
Yeah. And I think Kevin's an ideal expert into one of the areas which nobody likes to use. I say nobody, that's not true. A lot of people don't like using is video, and yet video is the most popular form of communication between people now. You can see that with the TikToks of this world. Video is really, really powerful, but we're not using it within the franchising sector yet. We're also one of the things that I'm starting to have conversations with people about. I'm no expert in this, but we as a sector, we talk to people about what our opportunity is. We shove in people's faces, this is how much you can earn, this is how you can. We don't find out what the aspirations of those people and how we can help them achieve their aspirations. And I'm not sure exactly, as I say, I'm not an expert, but I do feel that there's something in it, and probably something quite big, that we are just pushing the offers into people, and we need to figure out another way of doing that as well. I also think that we need to, going back to the video a bit, we need to become a lot more personal in our approach and not hide. I think it was you, Kevin, and you can probably talk about this a lot better than I can. I think you used the word franchisors hiding behind their brand. Yeah. Perhaps you could just, because I'm no expert on that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, yeah. So happy to talk about, and I was reflecting on the TikTok thing. I think that obviously, Natalia, you were saying about, what are our target audience on a different channel to what we're on, and we need to be where they are. So that's not true for TikTok for every. I mean, it's becoming true for most brands. Probably there is some value of being on TikTok, but obviously there are some brands for whom TikTok is more of an issue. So if you're in QSR, especially, or one of the sort of more youth sort of brands, or something focused on kids or teenagers or people in their 20s, if that's your brand focus for end users, clients, then customers, then TikTok is obviously really should be way up your list. And I think the whole premise of TikTok scares especially franchisors, because if you think about the whole point about franchising is there's a system and it's steady and you crank the handle and you do this and it's all planned. TikTok doesn't work like that, right? And if you see somebody who's really good at this, if you listen to Anne-Marie talking about how it works, you have to be driven. What works really well on TikTok is you have to see what's trending right now, what songs are trending, what dances are trending, what crazes are trending, and then put your little spin on it and kind of jump in, right? And so you think of that conversation, franchisee, franchisor, you might have a franchisee that says, hey, can I go and do this silly dance? And the franchisor's thinking, is that on brand? What's the song that's using? What are the lyrics using? Is that part of our, is that appropriate? And even just thinking about that, by the time they've had the committee and the meeting and the, it says, yes, it's pretty, yeah, but that was like a month ago. It's not trendy anymore. And so it does. How do you have that conversation, franchisee, franchisor? Unless the franchisor is driving it, it's going to lead to a lot of frustration, because that whole relationship probably moves too slowly to work in the world of TikTok, right? The other thing I see a lot is that, I'm, as you know, I'm relatively new to the world of franchising, and the number of franchisors that I say, could I see your brand guidelines? Because I'm doing something that will say, by the way, do you have any video brand guidelines? And they go, oh, no, we haven't got any. It's like, right, so how do your franchisees know if they're on brand? Because you haven't even told them what an on-brand video would look like. You haven't given them any assets. You haven't given them any animations. Like, what does the logo, if they go and animate your logo, is that on brand or not? Well, who's to say? Because you haven't given them an animated version of the logo. I haven't given them any intro, outro, or anything, right? So what fonts should they use? And so, yeah, do you see what I mean? It raises quite a lot of issues that most franchises haven't really engaged with yet.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely spot on, but it's because I suppose, we are still, and I think we're coming out of that now, but, go back 10, 15 years, we were very much, video wasn't really that, popular, or wasn't something that was being used that much. Social media wasn't something that we were using or in that way. And so, but absolutely now for franchisors, that should be part of their consideration. So if you have brand guidelines in terms of brand guidelines for anything that's published, for anything that's printed, for anything that's written, you should also have brand guidelines for, as you say, videos, or those brands who are using social media, should focus on making sure that they've got brand guidelines and, in a way, and instructions on how to use that specific forum, and that specific outlet. So, absolutely, granted. I mean, it always will depend on who your client or customer is, right? Because home care will always be sort of looking back a generation or two, as opposed to looking forward. Although, of course, depends on what type of care we're talking about. Of course, there are younger children and adults who need care, but when we think about care, we think mostly about sort of older generations. And they're not necessarily going to be on social media, so that's not that much of an issue. But yeah, children's sector, that's all going to be very much, I mean, I look at my 5-year-old nephew and I'm blown away by the way he uses internet. And, it's terrifying because he can find stuff much quicker than I can. And,
Yeah.
I consider myself quite proficient in that.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, yeah.
it's just pushing
No,
buttons and crazy.
you brought up a point, Kevin, which I hadn't even considered, and yet it's so obvious. But it's so obvious we're missing it. And again, I'll go back to when I was with Tutor Doctor. We did a whole new branding exercise, brought in consultants and everything. It's a big, big deal and a big rollout. And we talked about communications on the last podcast, and it seems to go back into communication quite often in our conversations. The whole process of rolling out the brand, the new branding, was across 16 countries. So it was a big deal. And now I think about it, that hasn't been updated. It wasn't too long ago. It was probably 7 years ago, I guess, that we did that rebranding. And video and social media was not part of that those guidelines.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. It needs to be there.
I think a part of it as well is having the nice thing about some of these things is that you can test and measure very quickly. You can try stuff, but I think that whole approach of test and measure, move fast and break things and so on, again, is often quite counterintuitive to the whole franchisor franchise setup. I don't think it needs to be, but I think it, because of the nature of it, I mean, I think you raised an example about communication. Things need to be communicated and changed over 18 months. Again, go back to my TikTok example. 18 months on TikTok. I mean, you could have a whole new thing that's overtaken TikTok in 18 months. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's just not fast enough. And that, if that's the psych, for some things, that's totally appropriate, right? But for something like TikTok or social media, stuff needs to be tried, tested, and measured much quicker. I'll give you an old example as well about being able to adapt. I remember I used to work for Esso, and I remember that. Do you remember Esso used to all have like the tiger, the tigers on tiger in your tank and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
and they spent ages developing tiger tokens. I don't know if you remember tiger tokens, and you get tiger tokens. They rolled this thing out. Within 24 hours, one of the other garages said, "We will accept tiger tokens."
Oh.
And suddenly, all of this effort that Esso had put in, because the other brand, I can't remember which brand it was, but another brand said, "Yep, we'll accept tiger tokens."
Wow.
And so all of that effort that Esso had put in, because somebody was really sharp and they got, "Do you know what? We'll piggyback off that." So that was neutralized because they were prepared to move really fast. So I think that ability, if you listen to Stephen Bartlett, he talks a lot about that ability to move fast is always been an important point in business. But I think right now that becomes a massive competitive advantage. Like, look at AI. So if you're, back to our driverless cars, if you're a brand that is prepared to adopt AI and figure out how to use that, then within a year, if all of your competitors have not done that, there's a good chance you're going to be way ahead of everyone else just because you're moving much faster.
Yeah.
But doesn't that go back to the fact that, I mean, you're right. Like, if franchising is about having a system, and that system needs to be a proven system, and so and that's essential, and that's there for a reason, because otherwise, it's you're essentially trying to get people to buy into something that may or may not work, right? But that's why it comes back to, but as a franchisor, your responsibility is to make sure that the business and the system are constantly being developed and are keeping up with the times, right? And it's that keeping up with the times that's really, really important. So ideally, you should have somebody within your team at the franchisor level whose job is to literally, to look at that and to be focused on the development of the business and looking constantly, sort of scanning horizons and going, what's happening out there, what's on the horizon, what's the future, and what do we need to do? How do we need to adapt our business in order to be future ready, tomorrow ready? And again, sort of, and that links into the franchisors, the requirement, to have either your own company-owned outlets where you can test things, or if you don't have that, then having franchisees who would be prepared to test new things and initiatives.
That was what was going on in my mind, Tim. Thinking about what you're doing about, where you've got those sort of really high performing ones. They're the people who are probably champing at the bit, already trying stuff out and wanting to try stuff out. And you've got a franchisor that's scratching their head like, how do we do this? That seems a really good kind of,
I'd agree. I'm conscious of time. We're just about running out of time on this show.
Wow,
so for this week, it's amazing how it goes quickly. But I would some great points just been talked about here. But I love there's a sort of combination of what Nat's just said and what you've said, Kevin. One is making sure that everything's the future stuff, what I call future proofing, is being tested and checked and looking at the future horizon and then rolling out. But then we've got to marry that in with the speed at which things are changing, because most of the change that's coming along now is technology driven, or there's even the solutions which are being in terms of products or services are going to have some technology behind them. And to your point, Kevin, if you're not on that quickly enough, it's yesterday's news, or somebody else has come along and done it. And therein lies a huge challenge, I would argue, for the franchising sector. And it goes back to this communication thing. How do we really embrace new technologies which can create new services or enhance our services to future-proof the business? How can we do that quickly and with agility, and also roll it out to the franchisees and the franchise network embrace it and get it out to the customers in a very agile way? There's a challenge that probably needs to be spoken
and the topic
about
for the next podcast.
Yeah,
there you go.
That's like one for another day. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been really good having this conversation again with you guys. Love meeting up like this. So I think that's podcast number 2 in the can.